Hello and welcome back to episode 14 of Ye Olde Guide. In this podcast we explore the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. My name is Liam McGrath and along with historian Daniel Gooch, today we are exploring the Cheshire town Warrington. A town of many industries. Warrington's history goes back to before Roman times. We're going to learn all about this. But first of all, hi Daniel, welcome back to the show. What first took you to Warrington?
The very first time I went, it was for rugby league.
So that's Warrington Wolves, one of the 12 Super League teams in rugby league. And this is our second rugby league town on the podcast. We visited Hull a couple of episodes back, and that has 2 of the 12 Super League teams. You're
forgetting one. You're forgetting Wakefield.
Sorry, of course. How could I forget?
Major team there, Wakefield Trinity, I think they're still
we had a great time visiting Wakefield Trinity as well. How could I forget? But it feels like at Warrington we're in the heartland of rugby league, I suppose. You're nearby Wigan, St Helens,
definitely.
Lee, Salford's not far away.
Yeah, and the Rugby League World Cup is on at this moment, so lots going on there.
We've timed the episode perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to learn a lot about Warrington in this podcast, but before we go into it, it's just worth setting out how we're presenting the podcast. We explore the towns we visit in 5 categories, and this is designed to make us explore the town from different perspectives. And in each of those categories, we're going to give our own personal scores out of 10 for historical interest. Let's start with where exactly is Warrington? It's less famous than some of the places we visited, so it's probably worth saying a bit about where it's located.
Absolutely. You're right, it's less famous, but it's a pretty large town. Its population's about 170,000, which is fairly substantial for a place that's not a city. It sits midway, really, between Liverpool and Manchester. It sits really on both banks of the River Mersey, between the historic counties of Lancashire and Cheshire. It first emerged really as an Iron Age settlement on the south side of the river, in the area which is today called Wilderspool, because that was the easiest point at which anyone could cross the River Mersey when they were travelling north or south. This point around being able to cross the Mersey easily there is, as we're going to see later, really, really crucial to many of the events that took place in Warrington, as well as its foundation as a settlement. The Romans founded the settlement, an industrial one actually, in the Warrington area around 100 AD, about half a century after the Roman conquest of Britain began. But it was the Saxons who later expanded the town to the north bank of the Mersey, so it sat on both sides, effectively in both historic counties. After the Norman conquest, the Domesday Book records a town called Warrington in that area, which is described as a village near the ford over the Mersey. So clearly Warrington's location as a crossing point straddling the river was continuing to be really essential to its existence and the notability it had. But it wasn't until 1285 that someone actually thought to build a bridge over the river and stop everyone's feet getting wet, with a second bridge later following in 1364. Warrington became known as a market town in the Middle Ages, but expanded greatly in the modern era. First of all, when industrialisation brought new trades, new industries to the town, most notably wire and soap manufacturing is probably the 2 industries it's most famous for. But then later, for a second period, when it became a designated new town in the 1960s and new suburbs were built, essentially attached to the area in which the old town was founded. One of the most famous events in Warrington's recent history was also one of its most tragic, the murder of 2 boys, 3-year-old Jonathan Ball and 12-year-old Tim Parry by the IRA in the 1993 Warrington bomb attacks, which are remembered today in a memorial in the town centre and in the Peace Foundation Centre in Warrington, which is named after both boys. But in recent times, recent town centre development projects have given us the town as it is today, and we'll certainly talk more about those later on.
Yeah, there's lots to say about Warrington's urban development, which we cover in the 4th category. So really, the River Mersey has been fundamental to the history of Warrington. The River Mersey is mostly associated with Liverpool. It's known, famous for being the river that Liverpool straddles, but also comes inland. And Warrington's really the point that it becomes a smaller river, easier to cross. And I think the crossing point at Warrington was the first crossing point of the Mersey for a very long time, probably until the Mersey tunnels were built in Liverpool. So we've got 5 categories to go, and we're going to start off first with politics and war. We're going to go back, as we so often do on this podcast, to the Civil War.
We are indeed, because there are a few notable events that happened in the Civil War in or near Warrington. The first point to make, kind of an overarching point, is a continuation of what we said before, that Warrington's historically been the easiest crossing point of the Mersey, and therefore it was a really crucial location to hold and control. Daniel Defoe said in the 18th century that Warrington was the only crossing point between Cheshire and Lancashire on an important road from London to Scotland, and in case of war, has always been esteemed a pass of the utmost importance. So we really need to keep this point in mind when we're looking at the battles that occurred there in the Civil War. It was really important to control that crossing. The first Civil War event we'll look at is the 1643 siege of Warrington by the Parliamentarian forces. The background here is that Warrington was initially in Royalist hands at the start of the war. In fact, 2 months before the war properly started, Royalist forces captured the town's arms store and erected some basic fortifications to defend it. For the siege itself, following a number of minor battles around the town, the Parliamentarians attacked Warwick in spring 1643 using cannon from Moat Hill, which is near St Elphin's Church, which still stands today and retains cannon shot marks from the firing of the cannon. The Royalist commander seems to have panicked when the town was fired on and ordered that the town be set on fire, which did happen, but Warrington remained under siege for another month until the Parliamentarians stormed the town and took it in May 1643.
Certainly an extreme response to order the town to be set on fire.
It is, but more common than you might think in these circumstances, unfortunately. Second battle was a larger engagement, actually, the Battle of Winwick, which is today a suburb just to the north of Warrington, which happened in 1648. Now, this was part of a second phase of the Civil War, which is sometimes simply called the Second Civil War, to distinguish it from the first phase, which happened in 1648 and led to the execution of Charles I after he had surrendered to Scotland and then made a deal with his Scottish supporters to invade England on his behalf. It's really a kind of separate military action from the first phase of the Civil War. Now, the Royalist forces travelled towards Warrington in order, as you might guess, to cross the Mersey. However, the cavalry crossed the river first, which left their infantry isolated on the north of the river. This meant the infantry basically had no choice really but to hold a last stand at Winwick, where they were defeated. St Oswald's Church, which also still stands, was used as a short-term prison to hold some of the defeated Royalist forces. So there's one kind of permanent reminder of the battle there. And then finally, we have the 1651 Battle of Warrington Bridge, which is part of the so-called Third Civil War, during which the now executed king's son, Charles, who later became King Charles II in his own right, tried unsuccessfully to retake control of the country in alliance with his Scottish supporters, whose parliament had separately proclaimed him King of Britain, not just of Scotland, and the execution of Charles I, because they weren't consulted when the English Parliament decided to have his head chopped off. The battle was fought over the bridge over the Mersey at Warrington, where the Parliamentarian forces had positioned themselves to try and stop the Scottish Royalist army crossing. It was the last battle that the Royalist forces technically won in the Civil War, but was probably more of a skirmish than a full-pitched battle, and the only outcome really was that the Parliamentarians retreated. It didn't have any long-term significance or change the resulting Parliamentarian triumph in the war.
But beyond the sort of these three major events in these three phases of the Civil War, have there been any other incidents of note in the political or military history of England?
There were a couple of Second World War connections that Warrington had.
Yep.
RAF Burton Wood in Warrington was the largest airfield for the American Army outside the USA during the war. At its peak in 1944, there were 18,500 men stationed there. So really, that's almost kind of a small town in its own right.
Yeah.
The airfield stayed open actually until 1993, and servicemen continued to be stationed there for many years after the war. So they actually provided quite a decent boost to the local economy. I looked at one estimate someone had put together, looking at 1957 alone, just 1 year. When you look at expenditure on local businesses and wages paid to local workers, it was in excess of £200 million at today's value. So really quite a colossal contribution to the local economy. The airfield itself is no more, and it's been partially taken over by the Gulliver's World theme park, which sits on the outskirts of Warrington. But that does still contain the RAF Burtonwood Heritage Centre within its grounds. So there's some commemoration there.
And there's a bit more infrastructure from the Second World War. I know there was a very large ordnance factory, which is no longer there, but it was a huge site, and it's now formed part of the new town. As well as that, there was a nearby prisoner of war camp that has a famous local tale associated with it.
Yes, indeed. There were a prisoner of war camps positioned near Warrington in the Second World War. That's not particularly unusual. We saw in our Swindon episode 2 how there was a prisoner of war camp nearby, which had some kind of impact on the character of the town at the time. But there is, as you say, quite an interesting story attached to the one near Warrington. It's happened one Christmas Eve when many German and Italian prisoners were marched into St Mary's Catholic Church just before midnight. The priest announced there could be no music during the service as the organist had been taken ill, rather unfortunately. But one of the German prisoners was an accomplished organist and volunteered to his guard to play for the service. And he played so beautifully and movingly, the story goes, that the entire congregation started weeping.
The entire congregation?
The entire congregation. Now, I have to admit, it's a lovely story, and the local history society in Warrington absolutely swears that it's true on its website, but it is a little bit too perfect. It's on Christmas Eve, the unanimous weeping, and there's no contemporary evidence offered for it, so I'm a little bit sceptical, but it's a nice local tale, so we'll include it here.
I suppose it is. The church is still there, and it's a nice tale. Also within Warrington, we weren't able to go inside, but there is a museum of policing.
Yeah, the police station there, it's been home to the Museum of Policing in Cheshire since 2004. I think it moved from Crewe. You can see original Victorian cells in there, but it is quite difficult to visit. You have to arrange in advance or be part of an organised group, so it's not particularly noteworthy for a casual visitor. But if you want to make the effort and book yourself in there, it's perfectly possible.
Yeah, there's a bit on the website that you could look at some of the artefacts. But really, that's probably it for politics and war.
I think it is, yeah. Honestly, there hasn't been an awful lot to talk about here. There were some Civil War battles, but even those weren't all that significant, though it is nice that you can see some of the tangible remnants today. You can see the churches that were involved, or even the battlefields themselves. If you look up some online battlefield guides, they'll help you find them and help you find your way around them. But there's not really much more in the way of national significance or even commemoration of important military events, with, of course, the exception of the RAF Burtonwood Heritage Centre. And we've had really nothing to say on politics, so it's unfortunately a fairly low score for me. It's going to be a 2.
Your description of those 3 phases of the Civil War and the importance of Warrington was interesting, but there's not really much to show for it. There is one of the 4 statues of Oliver Cromwell in the town, and we do have the Burtonwood Heritage Centre, but there's not much tangible left. So for me, it's going to be a 2.
Okay, 2 out of 10 from each of us, so that's 4 out of 20 overall.
So our second category is arts and culture. And I think if you asked most people who's the most famous writer that we can associate with Warrington, they would say Lewis Carroll.
Yep, absolutely. Warrington does make a claim as the home of Lewis Carroll, the famous novelist, probably most famous for writing Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, amongst many other works. Carroll was born with the name Charles Dodgson. He was also quite an accomplished mathematician, and this surprised me. He invented the word ladder. I mean, it surprised me because it seems such a simple concept that I can't imagine anyone actually needing to invent it. This is if you're not familiar with it, it's the game where you start with one word, have to get to another word by changing one letter at a time and forming brand new words in the middle. So if you wanted to get from word to land, then the second clue might be someone who sits in a parliamentary house, and then you change word, the W to an L, it would be Lord, which is getting you one step to land. But yeah, apparently he did invent it. I'm not actually going to go into too much detail on Lewis Carroll here, because he was actually from Daresbury, which is not really all that close to Warrington as we know it. It's actually closer to the town of Runcorn, so it's a little bit difficult to give Warrington too much credit for him, but he is nonetheless commemorated in Warrington. There's a statue of the Mad Hatter's tea party in the town's old market square. There are a couple of pubs with Lewis Carroll themed names, so he at least gets a mention in this category.
That's right. And I think if you were visiting the area, there is a heritage centre in Daresbury, and there are, no one knows for certain, but it is claimed that the Cheshire Cat, the grinning cat character, is inspired by a carving at St Wilfrid's Church in Grappan Hall, which is a village which is kind of subsumed into Warrington. But I've heard alternative origin stories. The All Saints Church in that village, by the way, has a more modern stained glass window memorialising some of the characters as well. So there is a bit of celebration of Lewis Carroll in the area. Talking other famous residents of Warrington or the area, our next famous resident is actually not a human, but rather a horse.
Yeah, old Billy, but not just any horse. The oldest horse recorded in history, and was
How old
born.
Was he?
He lived till he was 62. He's not alive anymore.
Oh.
He was born in 1760, so he's been dead for a while now.
Oh,
But,
right.
he was born in Woolston, on the outskirts of Warrington. 62 is it's a very, very good life for a horse. It's over double the average life expectancy of a horse. And he spent his whole life towing barges up the River Mersey. Now, we've put him in the...
I wonder if it's... Sorry, I was just wondering, it's double the average age, so that's the equivalent of a human living until 150. So at the time, you can imagine this horse would have been very famous. And what did the horse do for a living?
He spent his life towing barges up the River Mersey. So once again, the river was crucial. And we've put him in the culture section because he did become a cultural icon in his own lifetime. There's a portrait of him in Warrington Museum. His head has been preserved, but split up and sent elsewhere. His skull's in Manchester Museum and his stuffed head's in Bedford Museum. So unfortunately, you'll have to go to those places if you want to see those artefacts. But no, he was born in Warrington. So
there's a painting in Warrington.
Yeah,
the painting in Warrington Museum.
Exactly.
So there's a little bit of retention of old Billy in the town. And do we have any other famous artists from Warrington?
We can return to a literary figure here, Anna Letitia Barbode, or Barbeau, possibly. No one's quite sure how she pronounced it herself. She was a romantic poet, writer, and essayist who was born in 1743, who spent probably her formative years, between the ages of 15 and 30, living in Warrington. Her father taught at Warrington Academy, which is an institution we'll be talking a lot about in the science and industry section. But the important point here is that she found encouragement there to pursue poetry and literature as her life's work. She went on to enjoy a career lasting over 50 years, really across a kind of a profoundly changing cultural backdrop from the 18th to 19th centuries, which is reflected in her work, in which she published poetry, novels, hymns, and writings for children. She did fall from fashion a little bit when she published a poem in 1812, which presented a critical satire of Britain's role in the Napoleonic Wars at the time. But she's certainly started to be appreciated more in recent times, so definitely warrants a mention in this category.
It feels like there's not a huge amount in the cultural category, and that might reflect the fact that Warrington's size today is much down. Its population size is much down to it being an expanded town. So it would have been a smaller town historically, nearby large cities. So not a huge amount in this category. Although I feel when visiting Warrington, there is an effort to build a cultural life. There's a cultural quarter, as it's branded, which contains, for example, the Warrington Parr Hall, which is a Grade 2 listed hall built in 1895. And it's on Palmyra Square, which we'll come back to. The hall itself contains a famous organ in the world of pipe organs, built by Aristide Cavaillé Cole. Apparently it's virtually untouched organ, so in the world of organs, quite significant. Around the Parr Hall, it's a sort of an area that's been branded as the cultural quarter, so you'll also find the museum there and the pyramid. So whilst I think Warrington's doing what it can to build a cultural community, there isn't much in the history, so my score is going to be relatively low. It's going to be a 2.
I think it's not Warrington's strongest category. The Lewis Carroll link is celebrated, but it's, to put it politely, a tad tenuous. Old Billy is mildly interesting, but hardly world-changing cultural heritage. There are plenty of famous modern cultural figures with minor connections to Warrington. Pete Postlethwaite, Chris Evans, Bert Kwok. So there are, if it's the correct term, alumni from Warrington that can be mentioned. But it's
Kerry Katona.
Well, another one, yes, of course. How could I forget? But it's perhaps unfortunate for Warrington that it sits midway between Liverpool and Manchester. So there maybe hasn't been that opportunity, certainly in modern post-industrial times, for it to grow a major cultural scene in its own right. So I think it's going to be a low score for me. It's going to be a 1.
A 1.
So that's
a 1 for Billy the horse.
That's it, yes. Well, half for him, half for Anna Letitia Barbode.
Very good. And look, these are low scores, but Warrington is about to fight back because our next category is science and industry, where our next category is science and industry, and Warrington is a town associated with many industries. Let's start, though, once again, with the significance of the River Mersey.
Absolutely. Warrington's industry has, like many of its other, historical events, always been heavily bound up with its water connections. This started properly when the River Mersey was made navigable up to Bank Quay in Warrington in 1690 by a local businessman, Thomas Patton, whose family also built the town hall, which is something we'll come back to later. This then continued when the navigation along the Mersey was extended to Manchester in 1720. There's an important first related to this as well, in the Sankey Brook, also known as the St Helens Canal, which was built to run through Warrington and has been described as the first modern commercial canal in Britain and England's first canal of the Industrial Revolution. Though there is an argument that Newry Canal in Northern Ireland could have a claim to being the UK's first canal of the modern era. But the specific claim that relates to the St Helens Canal, it relates to the fact that it wasn't just making an existing waterway navigable, but it incorporated a completely new artificial waterway along the Sankey Brook Valley. So there is a bit of a uniqueness to its claim. It was built in 1757, just 2 years after the Parliamentary Act which authorised its construction was passed. It fell into disuse in the first half of the 20th century, but there's been some modern restoration which has left most of the remaining canal within Warrington filled with water, but unfortunately so many bridges have been built since that you can't just travel through the town by this canal anymore. So the impact is really just aesthetic, but no, that's still important.
Still, that's a really big potential first for Warrington, and I'll give you another first, similar location, the Great Sankey Railway Viaduct, which actually goes over the canal. This is sort of in the northwest of the town today, within the expanded area. Arguably the first major railway viaduct built as part of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1833, which, as you know, was the first intercity passenger railway, and it was designed by Robert Stevenson and his chief draftsman, Thomas Longridge Gooch.
Another Gooch on the railways.
Brother of friend of the podcast, Daniel Gooch.
It's that Venn diagram again, isn't it?
Believe it or not. So we can't get away from Daniel Gooch, but this was his brother. So the Gooch family, big on railways.
Yeah, very much so.
Back in the day.
Absolutely.
Must have been fun Christmases they had.
What, talking about trains, getting their model railways out? Do you think they gave each other model trains for Christmas?
They probably did.
Train tea sets, that sort of thing.
So there's a couple of firsts in the history of transport in Warrington. But let's go on to some of the industries, big industries coming from Warrington. Where do you want to start? I
think I'd like to start with a bit of an interesting one. The shipbuilding industry that used to exist in Warrington, including the famous ship RMS Taylor, which was constructed there. The shipbuilding industry was short-lived, but it was quite significant. It was on Bank Quay, and it grew up in the mid-19th century, and it has a connection with the RMS Taylor, which sank in one of the largest shipping disasters in British history. It predated the more famous Titanic by several decades. Warrington is a bit of a strange place for one of the largest passenger ships of its day to have been built, considering it's 20 miles away from any deep water. And there was certainly a history of small sailing barges travelling in Warrington since the Mersey had been made navigable earlier on. But this had dropped off by the 1850s due to the deteriorating condition of the river. But nonetheless, the Taylor, which was a vast iron clipper that could carry 650 people, was built there in the 1850s at the Charles Taylor Foundry. This foundry had already been established for making other iron goods like naval cannon, and it won a lot of prestige by gaining an award for its exhibit at the Great Exhibition and producing great bridges and locomotives for countries all around the British Empire. So there's a definite thread there from existing industries in Warrington into this significant shipbuilding industry that it had in the 1850s. And the firm itself expanded into shipbuilding, built at least 15 iron ships from 1846 to 1857. And there seems to have been quite a lot of local pride in the works being done here. Lots of locals turned up to watch the Taylor being launched on the River Mersey. I do wonder whether they were maybe just in disbelief as to whether it could be launched at all, but it was indeed. And the ship was chartered by White Star to carry passengers and trade to Australia. But like the Titanic, which was also operated by a company called White Star, it sank on its maiden voyage, which was launched from Liverpool, which is just up the Mersey from Warrington, of course, in 1854, killing 370 of the 650 passengers on board. It sank partly due to deficiencies with its equipment. Compass failure was one of them. And it ran aground at an island just off the coast of Ireland. Unsurprisingly, given the connections with White Star and the great loss of life, the disaster has been described as the first Titanic, though it's probably fair to point out that the two White Star companies were separate corporate entities, just with sharing the same name. And after the sinking, there was this local pride that had been in Warrington. The ship's construction there seemed to turn into kind of a sense of shock and disbelief. The local newspaper, in a contemporary report, openly admitted in an editorial that the news wasn't believed in the town at first, and they'd sent a reporter up to Liverpool specifically to check its veracity. The newspaper even expressed a bit of pretty misplaced optimism that the ship might be raised and used again for a few days after it sank, but it wasn't raised, and shipbuilding in Warrington ended within just a couple of years of the sinking, simply because ships were becoming just too large for launching into the Mersey at this point. The foundry itself is closed, and there's no trace that remains on Bank Quay, but the Taylor sinking is still remembered in a display at the Warrington Museum. So there is a bit of a local memorial to it there.
So I read that the compass didn't work because of interference from the amount of iron in the ship.
That's exactly it.
An oversight to me.
Exactly it. Yeah.
That's remarkable. So there was a period of shipbuilding that's unexpected, but that's great to learn about. I suppose it's quite far inland. Although later, of course, the Manchester Ship Canal was built, so we ended up having ships as far east as Manchester. But that's a separate episode. Other industries, shipbuilding, very interesting. What else?
Yeah, shipbuilding, interesting but short-lived. But Warrington does have a much lengthy history in other industries. Some of the early modern industries, the ancient trades in the area, included cockles and salmon from the River Mersey, gooseberry growing. There was notable activity in the early modern period in brewing, printing, tanning and sawmills. But the one industry that Warrington is most known for is wire production. It's still seen today in the nickname of Warrington's rugby club, The Wire, and the local radio station, Wire FM. And the industry grew, again, from an existing trade that was carried on there, pin making, because pins are essentially just, if you think about them, pieces of sharpened wire with a flat bit on the end. This, in turn, grew from Warrington's existing copper industry. So, as with many of these things, you can trace a lineage through Warrington's industrial past up to its major trades of the modern era. The wire production process itself is quite fascinating. It worked by producing large rods of metal in local foundries, heating them and cooling them to soften them, and then pulling them through a kind of a template hole in a plate, which gave the thickness and the shape, whether it was say round or hexagonal, for the wire. It sounds to me a bit like very hot and very, very dangerous Play-Doh, if you want to visualise it, with someone pulling it through at the end.
Yeah.
And the wire had to be pulled usually several times. You couldn't normally just go straight from the big thick rod to the little thin wire. And it was performed with special pliers until the 1920s, when automation kicked in, as it tended to do with these things. But wire drawers themselves, the people who actually did the wire pulling, were quite respected workers in the town, actually. They earned very well. They had rooms in pubs set aside just for them. They were called guinea rooms, as you had to pay a guinea to enter, which only the wire drawers could afford. And while the industry's now gone, Warrington Museum does own a fascinating remnant, actually. It's a bird's nest obtained from one of the old wire factories, made of old pieces of wire, which the birds had just picked up and formed into their nest rather than twigs. They actually have a short blog on this in their website, the Warrington Museum website, where you can see the photo if you're interested in having a look at it.
That's absolutely incredible. I do love that wireman snobbery.
Yeah.
You have to be a wireman to get in the lounge. Very good. Other big industries included soap.
One of the first things you see when you arrive into Warrington Bank Quay Station, which is the main station on the West Coast Main Line, is the enormous Unilever factory right next to it. There's no big high wall between it. There's just a fence, I think. So it's right in your view. You absolutely can't miss it. And this factory produced Surf and Persil washing powder, the latter since 1909. It's a very old brand, but actually closed very recently, the factory in 2020. It's a bit of a local landmark, and it's a direct remnant, really, of Warrington's long history in soap production. This history dates back to the 1750s, when soap was produced by the Mersey, and then the factory itself was established in 1815 for soap production by a young man called Joseph Crossfield, but then taken over later by Unilever in 1964. One intriguing remnant of the factory's past is there's still the old Joseph Crossfield and Son entrance, which remains at the Unilever building. So it's nice to see this has survived for, I suppose, over half a century of Unilever ownership.
Sort of recognise your feelings on the scale of the factory. It's very in your face, isn't it? You get off the West Coast Main Line station at Bank Quay, and it basically says, "Welcome to Warrington Industry."
Absolutely.
Which I certainly find exciting. And I think that brings us nicely on to really quite an iconic industrial history.
The factory's probably other most famous landmark is the Transporter Bridge, which spans the River Mersey. There were originally 2 transporter bridges in Warrington, but only this one remained. It was built in 1915 and used until 1964 to connect railway at first and then later road vehicles between the 2 sections of the Crossfield Soapworks factory, either side of the river. The bridge was Grade 2 star listed in 1975. It has a span of 61 metres with a total length of 103. And the span is held 23 metres high up in the air because, to explain how a transporter bridge works, it works by carrying vehicles across the river, not on the span itself, as you would normally get with a bridge, but in a special container which is suspended below the span of the bridge 23 metres up in the air. This meant that the span could be built high up, transport things over when needed, but there would be nothing permanently blocking traffic along the river. There are only a few transporter bridges left in the world. There are about 8 to 13. It really depends on your precise definition, but that's still only a handful. And only 3 or 4 in Britain, again, depending how you define them, because the one at Royal Victoria Dock in London has so far only been used as a footbridge. The transporter bridge in Warrington doesn't work anymore, unfortunately. It is possible to get up to it and have a look at it. It's not particularly simple, though. So if you do want to go to it, I wouldn't just be relying on Google Maps or Apple Maps for that. I'd look up some fully guided directions online for how to get there, or if you can, go as part of an organised group.
I think that's right. And there is quite a good website organised by the Friends of the Transporter Bridge, which has got some more detailed description on how to get there. So I think that's the way to go about it. But I think the reason these transporter bridges they're sort of popular is because they've got that vast scale, because by necessity they have to be high. But they've also got that Victorian industrial appearance because of the truss structure. So if you think of the 3 towns in Britain that have got transporter bridges, Middlesbrough, Newport, Warrington, in all of those towns, it's quite they're appreciated local structures, evocative of a past industrial era.
I think there's also something quite intriguing about them when you first see them as a child or an adult or whatever, and you think, well, how did that work? Especially one that isn't working anymore. You think, did cars just get transported up in a big lift or something? And then you find out, no, they were just carried across in a gondola.
Because I think the other 2, Middlesbrough and Newport, I think at the moment they're not working, but they're both being refurbished. So we will still have 2 working transporter bridges for those that want to try one. I must admit, I'd quite like to.
I'd have a go, certainly.
So we touched on it earlier. The Warrington Academy.
Yeah, but we should get more into details here, because this Warrington Academy was a pretty important 18th century dissenting educational establishment. It was founded in 1757 and dissenting in the sense that it provided education for those who dissented from Church of England teaching and doctrine, people who at that point were barred from entering any university in the country. It was very important in the development of Unitarianism in Britain, which is a branch of Christian belief that holds that Jesus was inspired by God but not himself divine. And its famous scientific and social scientific alumni that were numerous, but the most famous ones include Joseph Priestley, who famously discovered oxygen and invented carbonated water. So you can thank him for Coke and Sprite and beer, I suppose, to some extent. And Thomas Malthus, who was the great demographer and a name that's hung very heavy over some of my work in the past, some of my demographic history studies. But there was lots of other output from the Academy and from its alumni, and the development of scientific ideas particularly. This includes an important early work on medical ethics, one of the first ones from Thomas Percival, and early writings on public health in general. As for the question of why so much quality and important thinking has stemmed from one institution, people have theorised that it wasn't necessarily the quality of teaching at the Academy, but more the underlying religious unrest which helped ferment these ideas and this kind of coming together of minds. The Academy building itself is no more, unfortunately. It stood on Bridge Street, was picked up and moved about 20 metres up the street in the early 80s, but no longer exists. So unfortunately, the only remnants are the intangible ones in the output of the Academy's teachers and pupils, but these are probably more important than any one building, so definitely worth commemorating as much as we can.
So some really famous Joseph Priestley and Thomas Malthus, really famous outputs from there. But there's been a lot there. Do you want to go on to your scoring?
Yeah, certainly. I agree. We've said a lot, I think. Industry and trade are clearly crucial, not just to the town's economy, but to its development and its identity. We have a couple of important firsts in the St Helens Canal and the Viaduct, and a unique local industry in wire drawing, which still has resonance today in the town's identity, as we saw in the name of the rugby club and local radio station. It's not going to be a top score here, partly because the commemoration is perhaps a tad less tangible than some might like, but it's still going to be pretty decent. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What tempers the score for me is there's not big hitting museums about some of the history of these industries. And I was reading online that there was a study done that showed that perhaps some of the industrial history wasn't well known or well engaged with. And there was a project coming out of that called the Warrington Wire Works, which has created a load of projects to try and celebrate that industrial heritage. But personally, I'm a bit of an industry nerd, and I enjoyed things like the Transporter Bridge, the canal and the railway. There's a few firsts there. So for me, it's a 7.5.
Oh, that's pretty good then. So overall, 14.5 out of 20 for Warrington. That's it.
Well, our fourth category is urban landscape. I think it's fair to say Warrington has developed in phases. So let's start with an overview of that element of its history.
Yeah, let's talk about the town layout, because kind of as an overview, Warrington's urban development as it influences the layout of the town today can really be split into, I think, two main eras. First, you have what I will call the Old Town area, which was originally centred around St Elphin's Church. So if we talk about something that happened before the 20th century in the town of Warrington, not specific, and we don't specifically mention a suburb or a village around it where it occurred, that area around St Elphin's Church is most likely where it would have taken place. For instance, that's the area where the occupying army stayed during the Civil War, and there is a plaque specifically commemorating this on the side of a pub there. But Warrington was also transformed later by the new town development from the 1960s. So often in the Oldie Guide we see location and transport links as the reason for a town's ancient foundation, but in this case, they're actually also a key reason for its being picked as a new town in 1968 because of its proximity to Liverpool and Manchester and its location on key transport links. Technically, Warrington was a partnership new town, which differed from plain new towns because the developments connected to already existing towns rather than being built from scratch to kind of connect with a nearby large city, as with, say, Milton Keynes and London. So essentially, the new town development grafted a brand new town and suburbs onto the old historical market and industrial centre. The new town development has been explored in academic projects recently. Particularly, there's one known as Days of the New Town, which you can find, mention details of it on the internet. It's recently had an exhibition in the town, and I think it's currently conducting an oral history project on people's experience of the early days of the new town development. So there are steps definitely being undertaken to commemorate the modern history of the town's development, as well as the old.
So on this new town subject, I don't feel, from my experience of Warrington, which actually for the new town, the expanded town elements is quite limited. I don't feel it's got quite as much interesting new town design as, say, nearby Runcorn. Nearby Runcorn's got a concrete guided busway and a city centre shopping mall, more in keeping with the new towns like Milton Keynes. So the Warrington's not really got that. So I think there's less to say on this one. I think at some point we'll do an episode on a full-blown new town. But nevertheless, it's transformed the scale of the town, and it's doubled its population. Let's go into the old town, though, as it were, and start and explore some of the more significant buildings in the town.
Warrington Town Hall is definitely a highlight. It's a pretty grand Palladian building. It's definitely more ornate than a lot of the similar Palladian public buildings we've mentioned before, like custom houses in Lancaster and Ipswich. It was built in 1750 for, as we mentioned earlier, Thomas Patton, who made the Mersey navigable to Warrington and brought, in that sense, so much industrial prosperity to the town. And you can still see his family's coat of arms on the town hall's pediment. The hall had originally stood in open fields away from Warrington Centre, but the town gradually moved and kind of enveloped the hall as the town grew, and this led to the construction of a perimeter wall around the town hall. Now, the south side is more ornate and definitely the best side to view it from, not least because of probably its most famous feature, the magnificent golden gates that stand in front of it on that south side. Mm. Those gates were originally made from the 1862 International Exhibition and supposedly were first presented to Queen Victoria for installation at Sandringham, which is her official residence in Norfolk. But the Queen didn't like them, so they were sold to a Warrington Town Councillor for installation in front of the town hall. And when you see them, they really do look like they should be standing in front of a royal palace. They don't look like the kind of gates you'll see in front of many town halls.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're very impressive. I don't know what Queen Victoria was on about. I think they're beautiful.
Maybe she had enough already. I can't imagine she was short.
She probably did, to be fair. I mean, they are very impressive, and they terminate Winmarleigh Street, which is in the cultural quarter. So you walk up this street and up the hill, and you've got these massive gates. And I think the only thing is they look a little bit incongruous, partly because the rest of the park. So the park is called Bank Park. It's a really nice park, but there's no railings around the parks. The railings were removed. So I wonder if historically it fitted in a bit better. The railings were removed for the war effort, as often happened.
Yeah, it's a very common feature, that, actually. Yeah, you go to lots of towns, you see parks, and you'll see the kind of the concrete footings with holes in them for the old railings that used to be there. Near here, Slough, there's a major park in Slough which is like that. Should
we go into the town a bit? And I think we should mention the covered market, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. It's the original Victorian market hall was first built in 1856. Originally, it was made of just brick and stone, but iron and glass roofed extensions were added later on. A new market hall was built as part of the new town redevelopment of the town in the 1970s. But this new market building was demolished in 2015 when the Times Square shopping centre was built, which is where the market eventually moved to permanently in 2020. So obviously there's not much history to the current market building if it's only a couple of years old, but it does follow an interesting story of kind of movement about the town in tandem with development of the town itself. And it's also a pretty nice spot to eat or drink in. It recently won a national award for the best covered market. And this has actually left the original Victorian market hall area free for redevelopment as a festival and entertainment area. And I think it really does provide a nice central focal point for the town.
I think you're absolutely right. I loved the market. I thought it was a great covered market. The the new and the old blending together, both in terms of the building and also what was within the market. Because I think it's got about 50 traders, and it's got all your traditional market traders you'd expect in a covered market, but also some great modern dining options as well. So really delicious food in there. But also, I think the broader development, Times Square, that you've mentioned, and that was completed 2020, extension of the town centre. And often I find these kind of modern town centre extensions can be a bit bland. A lot of what's in it, it's got a multiplex cinema, a car park, offices, retail. So often that's bland, but I think this is a really good development. I think it's got a couple of... Well, I tell you why. There's just some effort's gone into the architecture to celebrate some of the industrial history of Warrington. I sort of mentioned in the last category that I thought more could be celebrated. You've got the car park, which is covered in 1700 aluminium panels. The panels have got hexagonal openings, which are supposedly inspired by the town hall gates and the history of wire you mentioned. Hexagonal wire. So that's turned a car park into a bit of a landmark. And adjacent to that, the cinema has got a strip of 3D pyramids made from aluminium that look a different colour from different angles. So it just gives it a bit of character. And the square itself, as you say, is a good centrepiece for the town. So I want to say a bit more about some of the elements of the town that surprised me, actually, because I didn't know Warrington particularly well at all, and I thought there were some areas of really quite pleasant and well-preserved Victorian conservation. So there's an area around Palmyra Square, which is where the Parr Hall is, and it's got some quite impressive red brick and sandstone buildings, such as the technical school, the gymnasium, the former courts, the museum is nearby, and I bring this up because I sort of went into the Warrington thinking very much about the industrial characterisation of the town. And we've seen that that's very much the case. But a legacy of that was that it brought some wealth, which has enabled these well-planned areas of Victorian town housing to be set out. And I think Warrington's done quite a good job of conserving that. Not always. There's some elements that are a bit disappointing. I think you'll probably mention the waterfront when you're evaluating. So I'll let you discuss that. But I thought that the area around Palmyra Square was good. And within that area, you've also got the museum and art gallery, which the museum itself gives a good overall description of the history of Warrington. But really, as a museum, I think it's one of those museums that's quite successful as a museum of a museum. It reminds me of the old Ipswich Museum, which I know you'd have been to many times, where you've got that classic Victorian layout of a natural history museum. It was built in 1848, and now it's a general museum, so it covers natural history, but also the history of the town. And it's a good little museum. I think it's worth a visit, and it's got an adjoining art gallery, which when I went had a feature called Cloud Factory, which was, and this was when I went in September 2022. This was Cloud Factory, and it was about one of those massive coal-fired power stations. This one's called Fiddler's Ferry. It's on the edge of Warrington. And it's one of those power stations that has those massive cooling towers. I think they're 114 metres high, 8 cooling towers. There's a lot of local sentimentality about them. So this gallery was just all these beautiful pictures and perspectives and paintings of these cooling towers. There's clearly local attachments. And, we spoke about the chemicals factory. We spoke about the industrial buildings that you see at Bank Quay. Clearly, you can get attachment to these massive industrial buildings. There's a certain awesomeness about them in the scale. And I think there was an attempt to list this power station, but it's not been successful. That sort of brings me on to my score, really. It's a bit better than I expected, because I thought the central layout of the town was quite attractive, and it was quite bustling when I was there. And there's also some green space and a ring around the town. Times Square is one of my favourite town centre developments that I've seen. That said, the good areas of Warrington aren't very extensive. For me, it's going to be a 4.
Yeah, coming back to a point you made around waterways, one thing that really struck me is that when researching Warrington, I was really expecting those waterways to be a really prominent feature of the town's aesthetic, because as we keep talking about, the town was founded as a ford across the river. It sits on the border between 2 historic counties. It was the location of the first modern canal of the industrialised world. And it really owes its modern economic growth to all that. But considering how important the river and canal have been to Warrington's history, it's surprising how limited a feature they are of the town today, actually. You can't really see them very easily unless you're looking for them, and it's actually even quite difficult to get to them if you don't know where you're going, if you're not seeking it out. You certainly aren't going to stumble across them. But it's probably fair to say that, while there is maybe not very much of ancient historical interest in the town itself, Warrington is a much more bustling place than I'd imagined, which I think is kind of your point that you made. Its townscape reflects a lot of immense recent change, which reflects its kind of economic development and a move in employment, from close-centred industry around the town centre, with the population all clustered there, to retail and development and more suburban living. So, it's not going to be first on the tourist trail for ancient buildings, but there's still, if you're looking for it, a lot you can experience in Warrington reflecting recent changes in British townscapes. So my score is a not too terrible 4, the same as yours. So that's 8 out of 20 overall.
So now we're on to our final category, which is the wild card. You never know what's going to happen in this category. This category is called reality versus expectations. Probably the most subjective category, because this is where we give a score for how much we enjoyed the town, how much interest we found, how much historical interest we found compared to our expectations.
Warrington, it's not a well-known town, it's not a well-visited town, so expectations have to be fairly moderate, I think. I can't say I found all that much to confound those expectations. It's a former industrial new town sandwiched between two major cities, and it probably has struggled to leave much of a unique mark on the world, aside perhaps from the Warrington Academy. But it's definitely a place with energy and with life, and it can still tell you a story about a particular kind of modern urban development if you want it to. So on that basis, my score is going to be right down the middle, 5.
Okay. Well, this is the most subjective category. I'm going to go a bit higher than you, actually, and I'll tell you why. My expectations were really low. It's like with anything, you do a bit of digging and you find stuff as we've set out over this episode. And I also managed to spend a whole day there, and I hadn't booked anything I hadn't booked an activity, like going to Gulliver's Park or a rugby league game or a gig. I just found there was enough of a narrative about the town, and I felt a good direction of travel. There was a bit more buzz than I expected. A busy town centre around the market gate. Sounds boring, but I thought there was a good range of shops. Golden Square, Times Square. I thought there was quite a bit there. And then there's this history and this industrial history. But I think my gripe, I share disappointment with the riverfront. I know that there's a master plan to do more with the waterfront, but I thought that was a pretty poor area, just dominated by traffic. And there's a cenotaph there by the waterfront and the bridge, and I thought that whole area was a bit miserable, just overwhelmed with traffic. I thought there were some areas in coming out of the town centre that were nice. I had a walk up to St Elphin's Church, for example, which itself was lovely. The immediate surroundings of the church were lovely. It's got an 18th century gateway, a couple of pubs nearby and on the way, a smattering of historic buildings, but the areas where more effort had been made to conserve, I felt it was rather pleasant. So I'm going to go a 7.
Okay, bit of a difference there, which is good. So 12 out of 20 overall. Do you think my expectations are just getting too high? Do you think the Yaldi Guide is spoiling me?
Well, look, these scores are controversial whatever happens, because we went to Bath, which is one of the most famous and attractive towns in the country, and we gave it good scores.
Yeah, we did.
Urban layout. I think we both gave Bath a 9, but Bath in the Oldie Guide's league table doesn't do very well because there wasn't enough in the other categories. So it's the balance of categories, and yeah, if you're not interested in industrial history, there's probably less to see in Warrington.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so that's overall politics and war. 4 out of 20. Science and industry, the big one, 14.5 out of 20. Art and culture, 3 out of 20. Urban landscape, 8 out of 20. And reality versus expectations, 12 out of 20. So for Warrington, the total is 41.5 out of 100.
Well, that's all we have time for in Warrington. Please do get in touch with your thoughts on the podcast. We'd love to hear, especially if we've missed something about Warrington. I know I said I didn't find the urban extension as exciting as other new towns. I'd love to be proven wrong. If there's some fascinating 20th century design that I've missed, please do get in touch. Visit the website, yeoldieguide.com. We're going to post some pictures on there, and there's more details about the podcast there, including other episodes. Please give us a rating or review, or even a subscription on your podcast provider. Daniel, have you got plans to go back to Warrington for any rugby league?
Not immediately. My travelling to the north days are a bit more limited these days. I used to pass through all the way to Ipswich games. I think the last time I was on my way to Fleetwood. Yep, certainly if the opportunity comes up, I'll be there.
Our next episode, we're going to a very famous city in the history of academia and general genius. We're going to Cambridge.
We're back on the tourist trail. High expectations for that one.
We hope you can join us in Cambridge. Bye for now.
Yep, bye from me.